I was asked at one point if I was
Welcome to the We the People lecture series. We're glad that you were able to come out tonight for our panel discussion on a spiritual response to gun violence. Can you all hear me? My name is Brownback, and I'm a member of the faculty at Phillips Exeter Academy, where I've taught religion since 1988. I'll be the moderator for tonight's discussion. We the People was launched in 2005 by the Congregational, Episcopal, and Unitarian Universalist churches of Exeter in association with Phillips Exeter and the Water Street Bookstore. It's a forum to explore issues at the intersection of current events and religion. And this is perhaps our 25th, 30th, something like that, event that we've had since 2005. It's hard to think of an issue that fits our mission more clearly than tonight's topic. In the wake of the Newtown shootings last December, our country has wrestled with how to address gun violence. Some states have moved quickly to enact new gun control legislation elsewhere. Legislators have spoken out strongly in favor of Second Amendment rights and insisted that the discussion be broadened to look not just at guns, but at the many sources of violence in our culture. We see these differences reflected in our own churches and communities here in New Hampshire, a largely rural state with a tradition of gun ownership. In our We the People events, we like to explore how we can draw on our spirituality to come together to work on issues that so often divide us. Tonight, we'd like to move toward a new conversation on gun violence. While politics and legislation are essential parts of this conversation, how can we broaden the discussion and work for solutions instead of stalemates? What can we, as people of conscience and faith, do to make a difference? Tonight, we are fortunate to have two prominent religious leaders here to help lead our conversation. Reverend Geoffrey Black, National President of the United Church of Christ, which is the parent association of the Congregational Church, and Reverend Robert Hirschfeld, the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire. Welcome to you both, and thank you for coming. Reverend Black was elected president of the UCC in 2009. Prior to that, he led the UCC's New York conference for 9 years. He has also served as an assistant chaplain at Brown University, associate minister at St. Albans Congregational UCC in Queens, a lecturer at Union Theological Seminary, and Protestant chaplain at Adelphi University. As a member of the coalition of Faiths United to Prevent Gun Violence, Reverend Black joined 4 dozen other faith leaders to petition both the President and Congress for increased gun violence prevention measures. Bishop Hirschfeld was formally installed in January. Previously, he served as rector of Grace Episcopal Church in Amherst, Massachusetts, and as vice chaplain at St. Mark's Chapel at the University of Connecticut. He has also been assistant priest at Christ Church in New Haven. During Holy Week in March, he was part of a delegation of Episcopal bishops, clergy, and lay people who traveled to Washington, D.C. for a day of prayer and action to reduce gun violence, organized by the Episcopal bishops of Connecticut. A few words about the structure of tonight's panel. Reverend Black and Bishop Hirschfeld will begin our conversation by offering their own reflections. I will then open the floor to questions. Please tell us your name, and I'll repeat the question if necessary. Finally, please remember that our mission tonight is discussion, not hostile debate. In that spirit, I encourage you to listen respectfully, to ask thoughtful questions, and to see what we can learn from each other. Thank you. Reverend Black, would you like to start off with our first set of reflections?
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a delight to see you and to be here with you for this conversation. I suppose that I will play the role this evening of the outside agitator, since I've come from afar, and I hope I don't agitate many of you very much, but would like to share some thoughts about our topic to get the conversation going. And first of all, we were invited to do some spiritual and theological reflecting about this as a point of departure. And actually, for us, I'll speak for both of us, I think that is a very natural and appropriate point of departure. So as I started just kind of thinking about this evening in advance, there was a passage of scripture that just kept coming back to me. And as it turned out, Robert and I both were thinking of the same passage, so I'll share it with you, and he'll elaborate on it. No. But here it is, and it's taken from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 26, beginning at verse 47. While he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs, from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword and drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" So here ends up the reading. And that's one of my points of departure. This was, of course, written, and the scenario portrayed is one that took place long, long, long before guns existed. But the sword was the gun of his day. And Jesus, in so many words, said something to us about the relationship with the weapon of choice, living by it. And I think that's the critical factor for me, is the notion of, what kind of both personal, psychological, spiritual investment do we make in a weapon? And that's the one that I just kind of hang out there as a factor that always shapes my thinking about this issue. Along with that, I would add just being a child, product of the civil rights movement, and its strong investment in nonviolent action and nonviolence as a way to bring about change also shapes my thinking about the use of all kinds of weapons, including firearms. The teachings of Gandhi and Martin Luther King really bring at home to me in many different ways and out of many different circumstances. And it is interesting to think that both of these prophets died by gun violence. So we see this intersecting our lives over time in a variety of ways. Well, there are a number of things I want to say, and we'll probably have an opportunity to come back to them later on as the conversation evolves. But there were a couple of things that struck me about this topic that I wanted to make sure I noted from the outset. One is that it really does come home quite often in ways that you don't expect. I actually, as I thought back over time, knowing that I grew up in a household, and I can say, and I'm not bragging about this is just my reality. I have never lived in a house where there was a gun. So my bias is kind of there. I just haven't had that experience. And at the same time, that doesn't say very much, because gun violence was all around me. And I was thinking about one time back in the 90s when my daughter was in high school, and I was just a parent living in Shaker Heights, Ohio. And a bright, beautiful morning, all the kids went off to school, and all of a sudden, and for some reason I happened to be home that day, there was alarm in the neighborhood, and what had happened was a young man who was college age, who had dated one of the young ladies at Shaker Heights High School. He was having all kinds of emotional problems. He was a friend of her brother at Ohio State, had actually been a roommate and of this brother, and had been trying to have a relationship with the younger sister. Apparently she broke it off, and the next thing we knew, in broad daylight, on Lee Road and at the intersection of Van Aiken, right there in Shaker Heights, he showed up. She was walking to school with some girlfriends, and he killed her. He gunned her down in front of all the kids. There was panic in the neighborhood. There was panic all around. And this was, and later on, a couple of days later, I went to the barber shop, and you know how barbershops are, the guys get to talking, and I said, well, you know, this came up, this incident came up, and I was new to Shaker Heights. I hadn't lived there that long at the time, and I said to myself, this is a terrible thing, you know, and all the, you know, the high school kids, you know, just kind of really alarmed, and the parents and the families, it's a terrible thing. And at that point, the perpetrator had been arrested, but he was not, how should I say, there was a real hush around the incident. The guys in the barbershop said, well, you know what's going on. I said, well, what's going on? I said, well, you know, here in Shaker Heights, we don't have that kind of thing going on. And so the powers that be are trying to put a lid on this. But this happened about 8 years ago. Another young woman was gunned down, and in the community, and it was, you know, quietly taken care of. So we wouldn't be surprised if this happens again. Well, I say all that to say that the issue of gun violence takes on many forms. It does have, there are those kinds of incidents, but when we think about it, there are a range of areas of our lives that gun violence becomes a factor, and they're always tragic. And I just, you know, as I reflect, and I'm going to stop here and go into other issues in a while, but there is suicide. I'm sure many of you have lost friends, relatives to suicide. Gun violence is there. There is the area of gun violence that happens in domestic disputes. It's there. We've seen that. Gun violence happens around situations that have to do, or are like Newtown, Connecticut, of course. These very tragic kinds of incidents where someone goes berserk and for whatever reasons kills numbers of individual innocent victims, be it in a theater or a schoolhouse or a workplace. That happens. There are a range of things, accidents where just recently a child killed another child playing with a loaded gun in a home. That kind of thing happens. So firearms tend to have this impact in our society, and we haven't come to grips with it. I would say that banning assault weapons, having background checks, limiting the size of certain gun clips, and restricting gun sales will slow the proliferation of guns available to people who are at risk and people who might have negative intentions. But that is not enough. And I think that we need to go deeper in terms of our understanding of, as a society, as to how we cope with this reality in our midst. I'm going to stop there and pass it on to you.
I appreciate your, can everyone hear? Okay. The fan is a little, is it okay? I appreciate your quoting the scene from the Garden of Gethsemane, which sets up Jesus in a moment of complete or nearing complete vulnerability. And it's a chosen vulnerability. He sets this up saying, if I had chosen, I could call upon the armies and the hosts of heaven to prevent this from happening. And instead, he presents this model of another way through this struggle against, or struggle with the powers of the world, which include powers of violence, coercion, control, and domination. For me, it represents the word that's quoted, that's used in only one place in the New Testament. It's in the letter of Paul to the Philippians that describes this moment. And it's this hymn that seemed to have been circulated in the early churches, throughout the churches. It's referred to as the kenosis hymn, or the hymn of Christ's humility. And it's Philippians 2. I'll just quote it. Do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility count others better than yourselves. Have this in mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. Take on the mind of Christ. And the mind of Christ is this: who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as something to be grasped or exploited, but emptied himself. That's the word. He kenosed. It's a kenosis, this sense of self-emptying and choosing to become vulnerable rather than to take up arms. Did not count equality with God as something to be grasped or exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of humankind, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. And this becomes the source of Christian authority and power. Therefore, because of this act of chosen, willful vulnerability, of disarming himself of godly power, it's out of this moment that God bestows upon him power and glory. And this seems to be, in the early church, the model of Christian power through humility. And then, of course, it doesn't last long. It doesn't last long at all, because as soon as the church becomes less of a movement that reflects and participates in this kind of kenotic, self-emptying power, realizes that in order to survive, it mimics the power of the empire and takes up arms. And then the whole history of Christendom begins, which we're just trying to shake off the shackles of now. So I'm thinking about that kind of power spiritually when I enter into this debate. And I think about it in terms of the whole history of the kind of collusion of worldly power and religious power. I remember seeing a bumper sticker that said it all. Guns don't kill people, religions kill people. And it's just, but the marriage of guns and religion and weapons, that is the toxic thing that we now, as Christians, I believe, are called to navigate in a new way. I was thinking about that when I was down in Washington with other bishops and clergy and laity and deacons. It was a very cold, snowy day in Washington, Holy Monday. It's the day after Palm Sunday. We had just heard the Passion. We just heard this passage. Actually, the passage in Luke, the parallel, when there's a sword drawn and an injury is done to the slave's servant, to the slave, Jesus says, "No more of this. No more of this." And I was thinking of that in the light of the story that I heard of a child in Newtown at Sandy Hook Elementary School who is huddled in with his teacher in an elementary school closet as they're hearing the pops of the assault weapon going on in the hallway. You can imagine that scene. I imagine my own elementary school when I imagine that scene. And a young boy who thankfully survived, maybe you heard this story, he said, you know, I know karate. I know karate. I can lead us out. I can get us out of here. And thankfully, he was restrained. He didn't go out into the hallway. But I thought about, that's the kind of power, you know, martial arts and a kind of physical weaponry that he was trained in, self-defense. But I thought, as Christians, do we adopt the same kind of power of kenosis, of this non-violent power that moved mountains in the civil rights era, and can still move mountains, I think. And now, it's not just the moving a mountain of the impasse of Congress and the Senate, which just frustrates and saddens me, breaks my heart. But it's deeper than that. I think we now have this, the power of empire which is being deployed through the agency of addiction. When I talk to people who love their guns, and especially assault guns and these high-powered weapons, they talk about shooting them. And they talk about the kind of thrill and how it kind of rewires the brain in a way that it drives a kind of the thrill that one gets, the same kind of thrill one gets from certain substance abuses, sexual abuses, and addictions. There's something about it which is, for a number of, I'm not saying this is an addiction among all gun holders, let me just state that. But there is something, when we hear about the heatedness of this debate, one wonders if there's something else that is enthralling us and depriving us of our humanity. And that's a spiritual question. What does it mean to be fully human? Does one have to have a weapon to be fully human? Because that's the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing. I'll just close with one other. This surprised me. When I went to college, there was a Christian, there was an Episcopal fellowship, and in the residence hall at the Edgerton House at Dartmouth, actually, this was framed. This quote was framed, and I'm wondering if anybody could identify who said this. It's kind of surprising. You might get it. Let me finish the quote before you identify it, for those of you who recognize this. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, we could say violence, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. You know who said that? Dwight D. Eisenhower. That's the punchline. That's the punchline. Dwight D. Eisenhower, an Episcopalian, by the way, I'm just saying. Yeah, good Episcopalian. But when we talk about, I've been wondering, my Christian brothers and sisters feel sometimes that there is a God-given right to bear arms. And I would ask them, where in the Bible is that? Where is that right bestowed? After Newtown, it was right before Christmas. And I thought, Jesus, God becomes human. He empties himself. God empties God's self and takes on our frail, human, vulnerable self. And he does it in this extremely thin place that is completely unguarded, undefended, unprotected in Bethlehem. And I wondered if there were people there to defend that scene of the incarnation with swords, then I suspect, in my reading of Scripture and my prayers tell me that God probably would have chosen another place to become human, one that's less guarded. So, how does that translate into legislation? I have no idea, but that's where I started. So thanks.
Very much. I think you've given us an invitation to think beyond the legislative questions, although those are important and relevant, certainly, and might be questions that we want to talk about tonight. But I think the underlying question that you've both named about power, our uses of power, and our ability to deal with threat, and all of those questions about human vulnerability and how we feel in the face of a power that seems threatening to us, however we might name that, are relevant questions. So does anyone want to begin with a question that will launch us in a further discussion?
Oh, look at the hour, it's time to go.
Silence them, but no. Go ahead, please.
There was an article that appeared in the New York Times on December 20th about national leaders of many faiths gathering after the Newtown horrible situation. Let me just read the headline from that. Religious leaders push congregants on gun control, sensing a watershed moment. There are two questions I have on that. That was back on December 20th. We've had our moment in Congress last week where we couldn't even get the necessary 60 votes to pass something that was less than what most of everybody here would like to have expected. Maureen Dowd, who writes a column that I appreciate in the Times, took our president to task, and I sort of sided with her on that, and the fact that she felt he was coming from the right position, but he didn't carry forth with the proper moves that could have led to that necessary 6 votes or something that were minus. That's on the faith aspect of whatever. The second part of it, though, is in that article that appeared in the Times, and this is really directed to Dr. Black here, is that there was no reference of the United Church of Christ. There was Salvation Army, Presbyterian Church, Methodist, Greek, Jewish, and I felt I was bewildered in the fact that the United Church of Christ is a powerful church, has always been on the side of justice matters, and here it wasn't even recognized. So do we have a problem with the media in who we are and what we are when it does come to justice matters? So those are my 2 concerns.
Okay.
Yes.
We definitely have
a problem.
with media.
And part of the problem is that
Many media outlets
don't understand progressive Christianity or choose not to acknowledge its existence. It's much more sexy and controversial in a growingly secular society to lift up conservative, fundamentalist, even crazy folk when they say something. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Salvation Army and others are that, but I think that that's a part of what is going on, is that it's news, for instance, when the Salvation Army or a more conservative group comes out, on a social issue. but it's pretty much true to form when the United Church of Christ or the Presbyterian Church or the Evangelical Lutheran Church come out on an issue, because we've been doing that all along. So that's one thing, and I think that there's and we've suffered from a kind of a downplaying of our voice, and this is something that we really, we're very sensitive to, and believe me, we were there. We had, we had issued the statements that that you would expect us to have done, but we can't count on the media outlets to necessarily carry our message. Okay, so that's one thing. The other piece of it, I would say, is that, again, going back to just the progressive voice of faith in this country is growing in its strength, but it just doesn't get the kind of traction that you would hope that it would. So I would say that we continue to try. We continue to work at the issues regardless. And in this instance, one of the things that we did, and we do quite often, is that we work ecumenically, so that what the National Council of Churches was saying and doing around gun violence at that point was really our voice. So quite often when you look at the ecumenical voice, you're hearing our voice along with others that we share. Now you say that we're a powerful denomination. I would say, yeah, sometimes, but the reality is that we're relatively small compared to the Salvation Army or the Southern Baptists, etc. And I think that's another factor, okay? But you said you had a lot more to say that I didn't address, but that was the point.
Is what we understand when we say a God-given right. What is our popular image of what that means? And that's so different than.
Part of what I hear in your
Question speaks to an issue that's beyond gun
violence and gun control, and it has to do with the role of the churches in public discourse. And what I hear in the question is a kind of grief that we're no longer the churches of the establishment. There was a time when, and I think the civil rights era was the pinnacle of it, when you could depend on that unified voice that had a place at the table in the corridors of power, of worldly power. And we just don't have it anymore. And I'm not so sure that's a bad thing. It makes addressing an issue as difficult as this very difficult. But the marriage of religion and political power that most of the people in this room, judging from the color of your hair, enjoyed at a time, is that church is dead. And that makes this even more painful. We used to be, you're in a place where it's the kind of the established church, even though there's a separation of church and state. But, a town in New England couldn't be founded unless there was a church here. And this is the birthplace of the town meeting. And that was that. And at the Episcopal Church, we often refer to our church as the national church. And we had a national cathedral. And we still do, although the foundation was cracked by an earthquake and its budget was cut in half about 5 years ago. It's not the icon, it's not the seat of that kind of marriage of worldly power that it used to be. So what we have to do is recover a sense of a movement rather than an institution that can speak in a unified voice around these things. And that's more difficult. That's more difficult. And it's also, and that's why we're feeling so frustrated.
My name is Charles Johnson. You've raised a couple of issues in this things that jive with me. Rob, you mentioned the bumper sticker you saw, people don't kill people, religion's guns, religion's, someone can't play it. So I guess, to me, that stays around, that whole guns don't kill people, people do, because there's got to be some feeling of truth to it. So, and what Reverend Black mentioned about the sword being the gun of the times. The weapons change. Now we have laser-guided bombs that kill people from the sky without a person even being there.
And drones.
So, drones, right. So, how do we reconcile responsible use and possession of weapons, or is there a way to reconcile it with the ideas you mentioned? How do we separate the people issues that underlie the use of weapons for violence from the weapons themselves, so that we don't needlessly just demonize people who own guns but don't have any intention of using them for anything but for a reasonable purpose?
A great question. A great question. Well, I'll try it first.
It's an amazing question. I remember once, do you remember that movie, Sergeant York with Gary Cooper? About a pacifist Christian who is drafted, and he finds his way out by discovering this passage in Mark, I think, about Jesus calling people to render to Caesar those things that are Caesar's and to God those things that are God's, and that somehow allows him to go and take up arms, and it just seems so facile. And then in the mid-20th century, there was this wonderful conversation between Rabbi Joshua Heschel and Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr was the great champion of a kind of Christianity that was realism. That we need to have one foot in real life. We can't just talk about kenosis when we're fighting the Nazis. And he's debating this with Rabbi Heschel and saying, I just don't understand how a Christian can make a cogent argument for the taking up of arms. This isn't going to answer your question. It's only going to illustrate the complexity of it. And that by asking the question, you're in a great line of thinkers and prayers about this. And he said, he was laying out these grounds for the just war, for instance, that needs to follow these criteria. And Heschel said, that makes sense to me as a Jew, I think, but I don't have a cross on the top of my building. So I didn't do anything to answer your question, just to say that is the question. That is the question. Maybe you can answer it.
Well, the question for me,
push the cord.
Okay, yeah. It really gets to how we have to think about and take the risk of the vulnerability that is required if we're going to really bring this issue to a different place. And part of me thinks about it in terms of the addiction factor that Robert raised earlier, that this country went through a great turmoil over booze, and we made it illegal. That was the solution, and it didn't work. And people kept drinking, but But what I think happened also was there was a willingness to accept regulation, and a lot of taxation, and I think that may be for a civil society, that may be the kind of middle ground around that may have an impact on firearms and the detrimental factor the way that it's negatively impacting the society. But right now, we're not even at a point where we're able to regulate the firearms. That the idolization of the gun is so deeply entrenched in the social fabric for at least half the population, or approximately half, that we have a long way to go in the art of persuasion around this issue. I think it's really, really big. If we're really serious about it, we had a conversation at the national offices of the UCC about this with a gentleman who, in a good spirit, he called us up and he said, I'd like to come and sit down with the leadership of the national setting, because I want to do something serious about this gun issue, this gun violence issue. And he said, I want to give a gift to the church if you'll take this gift and use it to do something really big with it. And so we said, well, come, let's sit down and talk about this. And he came and he was prepared to write a check for $25,000. Now, in the scheme, broader scheme of things, and we didn't say this up front because we welcomed the gift and the intent was definitely sincere. But as we talked about what it will take to change this issue, $25,000 is not even a down payment. But what we were able to all agree on, and he was still willing to plop down this $25,000, was what we're talking about is taking on, over time, over the long haul, being engaged in a movement with many of the other players to turn the conversation around. And that means being able to take on the financial might and the political might of the NRA. Now, that's realist to me. That's the only way this is going to happen, is if people get so angry that they're willing to sustain the struggle over a long period of time and pay the cost of taking on the NRA. And that's a media struggle, that's a legislative struggle. It's all those things wrapped up in one. But that's the only way I think that we're going to get to a different place. And it's not the place that the NRA says that we're trying to go. It's not the place of taking people's guns out of their homes and so forth and so on. It's about convincing the body politic that the gun is not the symbol of we're not dependent on the weapon to be free. I'll stop there.
I was thinking about the article that you mentioned with Maureen Dowd was taking President Obama to task, I think, for not arm twisting enough, for not doing enough to kind of get in there and make this palatable, make this possible. And I'm curious it seems in a way that he's faced with the same kind of shift in power, because obviously the days of Lyndon Johnson are long gone, and the days when a president can do that kind of backroom politicking are not there anymore. Do you have the sense that this is that he could be doing more on this, or do you have the feeling that he's holding out for almost a more authentic conversation? I sometimes feel that way. He's actually wanting it to be not a backroom twisting, arm twisting. What's your sense of that?
I just got through talking, but I can't resist. No, I think there was President Obama was at a dinner or something recently. I just caught a clip of it where he was at Planned Parenthood's dinner, yeah. He said something like, well, I think one of the leaders of Planned Parenthood said that there are people who wake up every morning trying to think about how they can stop Planned Parenthood from doing what it's doing and what it's doing. And Obama said, you know, they said this was the only organization that faced that reality. And he, you know, jokingly said, if you were on the White House staff, you know better. I mean, and I think that what I'm getting to is that President Obama, you know, God love him, and, you know, he's, you know, doing, you know, all the right things. He can arm twist all he wants. There's a crowd in Congress, you know, this is a very biased statement, okay? This is Geoffrey Black, okay? There's a bunch in Congress that it doesn't matter what President Obama says. It doesn't matter what President Obama says or does. If he doesn't say exactly what they're saying, he is not going to be able to convince them to do anything. And I think that that's something that is hard for people to really accept that. And I'm going to say it, that race is a factor in anything that goes on legislatively right now. It's irrational, it's inappropriate, it's crazy, but there's some people who cannot work with this president on any grounds. So I think that's a part of the calculus. It's not the whole story, but I think Maureen Dowd and others who think that President Obama can twist arms are fooling themselves.
I can just share a snippet of my learning from my trip on that day of walking the way of the cross, witnessing against gun violence. The bishops met with the White House staff just before we started, just across the street at St. John's Church in Lafayette Park. And there are two things that jumped out of mind. One was very trivial, that the aides, the White House aides who were managing the legislation are in their mid-20s. These are the people who are running the government. It was like, oh my gosh. It was amazing. And they know their stuff, and it's amazing. But the heartbreaking thing is the realpolitik of our life now, is that you're working, as we discovered in that vote last week, you know, it's the margins that have to be worked on. It's the swing votes. It's the ones who are the constituents are clear that they want to vote, for greater regulation. They want to vote for greater regulation, but they're anxious about the power of the lobbyists and the NRA and others. And the phenomenon of a president getting too close to the legislators and appearing to be too close and putting too much pressure on would actually harm them from getting reelected again. And a good part of that is a race issue. And it's the other part is just the intractable disparities and the divisions that are in a dysfunctional Congress. And so as religious leaders, to bring this back to the spiritual truth, is that there seems to be a call now for the church, which when it was the most alive in the history of the church, it found itself on the fringe. It was always on the margins. And I think we're discovering that we have to discover we have to relearn what it means to be there, to be effective. And again, it's difficult. Let me change microphones.
Yeah.
One at the roof.
What kind of public leadership our churches, our religious organizations can take to help human beings in a secular society to understand our need to reduce turning to violence to solve problems? Because I think what you mentioned, Bishop, that we're maybe on the margins again,
Yep.
and we need to move forward. What can we do to represent that 93% that
Right.
want to reduce violence? What can churches and other religious organizations do?
Did everyone get a question? What kind of leadership, what can we do to give voice to the 93% who are concerned about this issue, and to give that the kind of presence that would lead to legislative change more effectively than what we saw last week in Congress? Is that your question?
Yeah, that's right. Visible.
Yeah.
Right. What are the public steps that we could be taking now that would give that voice of leadership?
It's a wonderful question. I was.
That's good.
I feel like maybe I should just shout. The House of Bishops is this group that I just joined, and it is really, it's surreal to be among these bishops. But they were really trying to draft a letter, a pastoral letter to be read to the churches. And all they could do really was to say, we need to have this conversation. There are two bishops in particular whom the whole house has incredible esteem and respect for. One was Ed Kaczynski, he's the Bishop of Oklahoma, and the other one John Bruno, the Bishop of Los Angeles. Both of them former Los Angeles Police Department patrolmen who both have guns. One carries a weapon with him as he's doing his pastoral rounds through the Diocese of Oklahoma. Both of them have seen gun violence firsthand, have lost partners in the force, just weeping, addressing the House of Bishops to say, we used to be so adamantly opposed to any kind of legislation or restriction or regulation to the guns, but now we have to have this conversation after Newtown. But it's not just Newtown; it's the pandemic, the epidemic of gun violence in the inner city, which is racial and racist in Chicago in particular. So that's just a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. I don't know, but I'm fishing and I'm working hard to find out how do we get this movement moving. As I was driving down here, I thought, I was driving down on 101, and I'm going at 60 miles an hour, and I could smell in the car ahead of me a cigarette. And I thought, I was growing up, I wouldn't have noticed that. Something happened around that broke up the tobacco lobby. You walk through the Senate in Washington, and there's tobacco flowers festooning the whole building, because that's what built our Capitol, tobacco money. Something happened that made it uncool to smoke, and now that's changing again. It's not a one-walk dog. We got to keep that out, But could there be a similar movement? Could we learn something that we learned in the tobacco wars? That's just off the top of my head way of addressing your question.
I agree with that, and I would add to it one of my favorite words when it comes to issues of this magnitude, and it's persistence. Persistence is not only to have a movement, but to realize that it's a movement for the long haul, and that people who really believe in this need to be persistent. And one of the things I thought about is how we mobilize, both inform and acculturate and mobilize young people around this issue, many of whom are very attuned to the concerns around gun violence, since they've seen their peers affected by it so directly. And I think that's another, if we're going to carry on the struggle for what may be generations, then we're going to need to do that. And I would finally say, just as an example, many people don't realize that Adam Clayton Powell Jr. introduced the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 into Congress when he was elected in 1946. And he introduced it every year until it was passed. And I think that's the kind of persistence that we need to think about.
I think to your point about smoking, that too was a powerful addiction. It was a powerful addiction that I think seemed insurmountable. It seemed impossible. I can remember trays of cigarette butts when I was a child at parties with my parents. We never thought that would go away, and it has changed. And I think the facts are on the side of, they were on the side of the anti-smoking issue, and they're on the side of this issue. I mean, the gun violence is not something that you can hide. It's not something that needs to be kind of propped up with good arguments. I mean, the arguments are...
Very good. I want to speak to that though. I think that these arguments, and I see hands going up in the back, so I'm going to try to be really quick. The arguments around policy on this do need to be buttressed with good, hard science. And one of the things that the NRA has been very successful at is stifling scientific research around this issue so that the money isn't available for all of the organizations and even government agencies who would do research on gun violence. The money's not there for them to carry out that research to give you the kind of data that would make a difference in your thinking. And that's a political issue.
Great. Okay, good. Yes, Ingrid?
I'm Katie Alloway from Atkinson Congregational Church. I would just like to say there was a time when the Surgeon General of the United States was really respected and spoke out graphically and continues to do so about the dangers of smoking. I don't want to be a wit or even half of a wit, but I would just like to say that perhaps we should pass a law saying that use of a gun is dangerous to your health, because it certainly is to the children who were living in Newtown. And perhaps we should say it should be engraved on the barrel.
You know, the public health organizations have already named it as a public health issue, a primary public health issue, so you're right on.
Okay, Elsa?
My name is Ilse Andrews. I live here in Exeter. You haven't mentioned the power of governments worldwide to declare war and wage war on most anyone they care to. And I tend to think that individual urges to own guns have something to do with this huge power of governments to kill. Now, I'm a South German Catholic. I've seen the Hitler violence. That's just an aside. But what I have often asked myself through my long life is why the big churches, including the worldwide Catholic Church, do nothing to prevent their faithful from going to war. And I'm wondering, with you gentlemen being at such an enviable position to influence others, do you think what you believe can trickle down to local religious congregations and encourage the pastors not to treat war and guns as a taboo subject or as something that has to do with politics, but actually to influence their faithful against violence? Do you think it can be done?
So the question that Ilse is asking is, she's putting the subject of gun violence in the context, larger context of violence, international war and violence, and asking if those two can be linked as that gun violence is in some ways sometimes even a response to the use of force by governments.
You raise a very, I think about this issue, and I think that we try to raise that concern around global violence. I mean, there are people who make the connection between the way we use use, and someone mentioned it earlier, drones globally, and I think that's something that I think the faith communities are beginning to catch up with the technology that has advanced this war making to a new level, and to speak to it. But again, the level of influence, I mean, we're in an uphill trajectory on this, but I think that there are many religious voices that I'm hearing that realize the state of affairs that we're in, and how profound and how deep we have to go in our spirituality to come to a place where we're willing to risk. And that's what it is, risk, respectability, public stature, credibility in the public realm, in order to advance that kind of argument. And I think that's what's starting to happen, especially, as Robert says, this notion that we're operating from the margins becomes much more a part of our sense of who we are.
I'm finding myself struggling with whether I should say this or not. We had the church that I just came from during the first Iraq War was very active in helping young people prepare files so that they could apply for conscientious objector status. And that could be done, and that is done, and there's a warrant for that in the Episcopal Church where you can, that's okay, as it is in the Roman Catholic Church if you take that stance. That's not provocative. When I'm on my long walks in the woods, I think maybe reinstituting the draft, where senators' children would be drafted, and that these wars that we're sending our youth to are not necessarily being recruited out of desperation, economic desperation. There is a question of equity involved here, and I see the camera there, and I'm thinking, what have I?
I can edit.
There's something there. It's a if we're going to be sending youth to war, and it's not my children, and then if it's not my children, I'm going to be more prone to to vote for a war of choice, and that's fallen human nature, and that's not kenosis. So it's sort of my response to your question. It's complicated.
I'm Natasha Tweedy, senior pastor of First Church in Rochester. You've both discussed at some point the idolatry question that has come up, and I know that the pastor in Newtown has also addressed that in things that he has said since the massacre in his town, the UCC pastor in Newtown. And I was wondering if you would like to work that out a little more with us, draw the connection between the Second Commandment and the Second Amendment.
I love that. Preach it, sister.
That's right. You're drawing the connection.
Need we say more? Idolatry is very interesting. I mean, you raised that word. We would have to do a lot of public teaching to get people to understand what the problem is. So that's, I think that's internally I think we can do it. And I think that there is a logical connection, there's a theological and biblical understanding there. But I'll say there are two levels of this. I think there is a world of Christianity that doesn't see that idolatry, okay? And then there's a secular world that couldn't care about idolatry. So but that doesn't stop us internally from becoming more and more clear about that, and about what we honor and what we worship and what we model our lives around. And you've led me to a different place, but when these things like Newtown, when these incidents happen, I always stop and reflect back on the last time or the string of times that it's happened. And the first one that came to mind to me right after Newtown was the incident in Pennsylvania, where it was all school children, and they were Amish, I think, or Mennonite.
Oh, the little girls.
Yeah. Amish, okay, but the response of the community was, for many people, mind-boggling. The response of forgiveness and grace and humility in the face of it, and living faithfully with that experience. I think that was such powerful modeling that some people couldn't accept it, but it made an impression on me, and I think a lot of us. Yeah.
Questions?
Bob.
Yeah, hi. I appreciate your response, nonviolent comments, and I very much applaud those. I was wondering, we know that maybe the problem is stemming from guns or a weapon of some type, but would you mind speaking to the possibility that the reason that children or folks that might feel obliged to use a weapon for whatever reason, there may be something else going on psychologically, that they're feeling a disconnection from their community and they feel alone, or they feel like they are just not a part of something for whatever reason, and then something sets them off at a point where they feel that they need to use something as a way of speaking. It could be, I'm not exactly sure what the reason is and why they're turning to it the way that they are, but could you speak about maybe the aloneness of someone in a community where they don't feel part of the community?
Could you hear that question? The question is, could our speakers speak to the question of someone who uses a gun because out of a sense of aloneness, or a sense that somehow they don't matter, or something has gone wrong individually or in some way for that person? How do we deal with that kind of question?
I heard him. Well, responding.
It's becoming so predictable that when we heard about Newtown, since Columbine, I think, and then in the events after Boston, you could almost predict the profile of the perpetrator, the sense of isolation, of disconnection from community, which makes them prey to a whole way of thinking that is just full of hatred, and it's like the compassion switch and the empathy switch just gets shut off. What's the solution to that? Community. And what I sometimes wonder about the religious communities, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, who and I'll just say this about the Episcopal Church because it's the church I know best. We have spent so much time in recent years just living in a stovepipe, that it's about maintaining our buildings, maintaining our staffs, looking inward, and meanwhile the youth have been, the presence of the youth is hemorrhaged, this is not so much an answer to that, except I'm deeply resonating with the phenomenon that you're speaking to. And whenever these things happen, it feels to me as though it's an indictment of our religion, the good religion, the religion that binds. The word for religion, the word for ligament and ligature, it's the same root. It's about those things that connect us to God, connect us to each other. and are living in ecclesiastical silos has made us immune or detached us from God's mission of healing and connection. So that's a broad way of saying I don't have any strategies.
There was a editorial by Tom Friedman recently, maybe yesterday, suggesting that what the Tsarnaevs did in Boston made no sense, made no logical sense. And I was thinking, of course it didn't make logical sense. It wasn't about logic in any way. It was really the response of pain. And someone else had studied this, this discussion of people in their situation, and said they're out to cause pain. And my sense was that when you're out to cause pain, you're out to cause pain because you're in pain, and that sense of wanting to lash out is a complete loss of connection and a sense of isolation. That it's interesting because we were talking about being at the margins as church people, and yet there's also this other sense of the margins. That sort of everyone feels at the margins in a certain way in this. No one feels like they're at the center of power, and it's an interesting dynamic that we're all in on this. We have another question.
I have a simple question. How much more must we do? By any measure, by measures across the country, by measures in this state, in southern states, in western states, in cities and in countrysides, 90% of us spoke on this issue, are together on this issue. Now, this is a narrow issue. This is not the whole question or the whole answer. But 90% of this nation, if you believe in the measurement systems, spoke on this issue. How much more must we do? This isn't around the margins. Do we need 92%? Do we need 98%? Do we need 120%? What is wrong with the system of governance that we are living under when 90% of us speak and it's taken away?
I hear your anguish and frustration with our politicians, and I would only say that at least the things I've read in the aftermath of that vote, and just recently, tell us that even though the 90% can say that they, are concerned about this issue in a particular way, that the politicians who made the difference in that vote are less afraid of you right now than they are of the NRA. It has been suggested that we in the 90% are not organized, we are not as vocal, and we have not played political hardball enough. So I suggest, again, persistence, the long view, and we have to be ready to make people pay at the polls. That's in a democracy, that's the way it will happen. And right now, the pollsters that they are listening to tell them that they don't have to worry about the 90%. And I would simply pause and say, yet. Okay.
It does sound like a certain senator.
It does begin to sound like a certain senator from New Hampshire is feeling more vulnerable.
Say that again.
It does, from what I'm hearing from the national press, not just the local press, that a certain senator from New Hampshire is really feeling more vulnerable as a result of her vote.
Oh, I hope so.
You know what? I got this also from the press, the handlers from the White House, that the way it works, and I was surprised to hear this, that the senators and the legislators in Washington do not really read the New York Times and the Boston Globe. They read the Concord Monitor and the Manchester Evening. They're reading the local stuff. They're hearing about these kinds of gatherings. That their staff is reading the local media. So, you know, when you flood the local media with letters to the editor, or you make news with a way, walking the way of the cross, or a pilgrimage, or some other kind of walk locally, that gets their attention more than if you do something that hits the New York Times. So that I heard from our president's staff. So that was news to me.
I'm a member of the congregation here. I want to thank we the people for coming this evening, especially to a community where a major manufacturer makes assault weapons. It's very courageous in a way, and very important to me. Speaking to the notion of movement, I am optimistic. I lost 2 members of my family to domestic gun violence, one 65 years ago. That grief and anger doesn't go away. It has simmered. I lost a second member of my family to gun violence 15 years ago. That has simmered. Now I'm finding an outlet. I am getting emails from Credo, MoveOn.org, Democracy for America, Democrats against AR. I'm finding a place to have a voice. The Brady movement has been there. I have now found how to be part of it. And this evening, and now this internet movement is enabling me to get rid of that simmering. And I came this evening to hear this, and I'm now optimistic. Will it last? I don't know. But it's more than a single voice. It's not just Brady. I'm getting 4 or 5 organizations every day asking me to participate and take part. And I am, and I will.
Do we have other thoughts perhaps about specific things like that are important for us to be doing right now? I think we've heard about the local letters to the editor are an important voice, which to the local papers, to the Portsmouth papers, the Exeter papers, that sort of thing. Credo, Move On, all those kinds of organizations. Are there other organizations that you would want to speak to in particular? Do you want to?
Well, I'd just like to speak about the church, and having heard some talk about, well, first that schools had to have a resource officer who was armed, and now, not too long ago, I heard that there was a church that had decided that they would have a resource person, I suppose during their services. I wonder if there's a way that the church can speak to fear.
You mean
a security person?
Well, that's the way I took it. I don't know what else they would have a resource officer there. So I just wonder how the church can address to the people within the church anyway, and speak to the fear factor that is taking over, and in that some people do believe in the church that a gun is going to do the job better than faith and hope.
So how do we deal with the fact that even some churches have considered having what they call a resource person to provide an armed response in the event of some sort of threat? How do we deal with that kind of question?
There are so many manifestations of church in this country that you're going to see things like that happen. That's so theologically and biblically inappropriate that it almost doesn't warrant, responding to, except to say that in the places where we are, and certainly I would take it on to say that our security is not in a resource person with a gun in a church. You know, I mean, we sing the hymns and we read the scriptures that tell us that where our security lies. It's in God and it's in Jesus. And I think we need to be very pronounced about that. Even, I mean, we don't shy away from talking about issues of life and death in church. And that's what this is about. And I think that I would simply, you know, stay on message that our security is not in the gun. And I would discourage that kind of thing in churches that I have any relationship with.
And I feel like I'm on the verge of saying something I shouldn't. You know, we might be, this might be signaling a new age of martyrdom in every sense of the word. Martyr simply means a witness, right? But there's the other more popular idea of what a martyr is somebody who is willing to give their life for the sake of the other. Here in New Hampshire, I'm the bishop of this diocese that has our own popular saint from St. James Episcopal Church in Keene. And there's a movement within that community at St. James of renaming that church, the Episcopal Church of Jonathan Daniels, who took a shotgun blast in Alabama, if I'm not mistaken, in order to save a young African American as he was down there for the movement for voter registry. And you know that just staying in a message
that our life is in Christ, the risen Christ, and we have nothing to fear.
Except that microphone.
Okay, could we just have maybe one or two more questions? I think we could, is there anyone who's had their hand up for a long time that I've missed? Okay. Yes, please, go ahead.
I'm from St. Christopher's Episcopal Church in Hampstead, and the thing that horrifically concerns me is the inability to have any kind of civil conversation with someone who is a member of the NRA or has guns or defends the whole idea, my guns, any gun, every gun I want, and you'll get in my way over my dead body. There's no dialogue possible, and I'm continually stymied by the fact that if you can't have a dialogue, how can you have change?
Did everyone hear that question? If we can't have a dialogue, how can we have change? Good question.
Well, you have to pick and choose your... I think we have to pick and choose our dialogue partners. And I say that not to be flip, but I think that some people you just won't get a civil conversation with. It won't happen. And I think that it goes, again, in a democracy, it goes back to where we cast our votes and how we cast our votes. Though people like that will probably live and die holding on to those beliefs. And I don't see a way to convince them other than having them experience life in a society that has changed the rules and has not taken away what they fear most.
May I make another comment? These are 4 people that I'm wonderful friends with at my parish.
Yeah.
We're wonderful friends, but not one of those 4 people can I even approach the subject of gun violence or any kind of regulation or anything else.
And I'm probably stepping over into a very, very sensitive area. I think that you can still love them, and I think you can still care for them and be a sister to them. And transforms. So, I think the love ethic has some merit to it in this situation. One hopes.
Due to this legislation and our problem there, we're really an intersection of religious values and secular values. And I'm wondering how we can present our values in a way that doesn't come across as Bible-thumping and be dismissed. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to some of those spiritual values that maybe can resonate with maybe the people in this woman's congregation that she's has in her circle.
So the question is, how can we speak to spiritual values that don't come across in a Bible-thumping way? Other ways are there to speak of these values?
See that microphone coming my way?
I think you probably know the answer to that. I think I know I was just at St. Christopher's and the hallmark of the Christian faith, what distinguishes, I guess, I'd go on a limb, I think, is what distinguishes us is the high value we put on enemy love. And the importance that we have on making sure that our history of this is sorry and checkered and very uneven. But the sign of God's grace and the Spirit moving is when we can stand around the same altar and share communion and fellowship. It's all about relationships. This is what it's going to come down to. And being able to have vehement, sometimes very angry conversations with those who are otherwise minded, and still acknowledge it. I never thought Clint Eastwood really puzzles me. Because he's built his career on the glorification of the gun, really. But the most recent films, I'm thinking especially of Unforgiven and Gran Torino, have been serious indictments of the violence in our culture. And I think that there's opportunities for conversations with people who have been converted in some way. And what he did at the convention, I just scratches my head. I don't get it. But there are bridges to be made.
I think on that note, we'll draw the conversation to a close, and I'd like to ask
Reverend Black and both of you if you'd like to say anything by way of closing, but you may have said all you need to say. Would you like to say something?
Just to applaud your having this forum. I think that this is just such a wonderful initiative of your churches ecumenically and other organizations to make this happen. I could only wish that this kind of event were happening in communities all over the country. Because this is where the conversation starts, and some of the things that we've been most anxious about can be addressed, and people beyond these walls will hear about them. And I think that it will be encouraging and inspiring for many who are not here, for instance, to realize that a couple hundred people gathered to talk about this issue in this town. That's going to encourage somebody to feel maybe all is not lost. Maybe there's hope. And I think that we need to always lift up our hope and work towards the kind of goals that make for a healthier and more whole society as people of faith. So that's what I would say. Thank you for being here tonight.
journey here, and there's one other person I'd like to thank tonight, and that's Beth Brosnan, who does a tremendous job with We the People. Really